Hi, I'm James Miller. Right now, I'd like to give you an outline of the Bible that summarizes the whole big book in just a few words. It's the view from 30,000 feet to try to tie the whole narrative together into a single bite-sized story. The reason this became helpful for me is because I grew up hearing stories from the Bible, but I heard them in no particular order. In fact, I realized early on that the only stories I knew about the Bible were the stories that had animals in them. I knew about Daniel in the lion's den and Jonah in the whale, and for some reason, Jesus was always surrounded by sheep. But I couldn't have told you what order the stories they came in or why I had learned the ones that I learned. I realized later on it's because people who publish Bible study curriculum are trying to sell it to teachers, and the teachers want curriculum that entertain their students. And kids like to hear stories about animals, so those were the ones that always made it in. The consequence was, by the time I reached college, I had no good sense for the structure and outline of the Bible. So I finally put it all together, and now it makes a lot of sense to me. I've captured this in my little treatise, Welcome to the Bible, an introduction for people who always wish they'd read it and never did. That's available on Amazon if you want to see it yourself. But here, in a few words, is the outline of the Bible. The way to think about the structure of the Bible is to picture the letter W. The story of the Bible follows the story of God's people looking for land. I wish it was more deep or spiritual than that, but that's the story. The whole book from beginning to end is God's people looking for land. And there are seasons where they are in the land that God has given them, and there are seasons where they're out of the land that God has given them. In fact, they're in the land 3 different times, and they're out of the land twice. And that's why we can use the W to remember the outline of the Bible. They're in the land that God promised them, and then out, and then in again, and then out again, and then in again. So you see how that's a W. Let me go through that outline following that structure and see if we can't tie the whole story together in one big picture. It begins with the story of Abraham and Sarah, the first couple that God calls out of the land of Ur. We don't really know where the ancient city of Ur is. If you ask an anthropologist where it was, they'll just say Ur. And Abraham and Sarah were called out of that land and taken to the land that they were to inherit, the land that now we call Israel. They stood on that land. It was theirs. They had it under their feet. And God said, I'm going to give you as many descendants as there are stars in the sky and grains of sand on the beach, and this will be your land. But there's going to be a season where you're out of the land, where you don't own it anymore, where it's not yours. The book of Genesis covers the first 4 generations of that family, from Abraham and Sarah to Isaac and Rebekah to Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Esau and down to the 12 brothers. Those 4 generations are the book of Genesis. And in that season, in that early season in the life of God's people, they live in the land that God had given them. But by the end of the book of Genesis, they've lost it. Joseph's brothers betray him and sell him off into a caravan that takes him down to Egypt. He ends up in prison in Egypt and then eventually is exalted to the second hand to the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. From there, he manages to save his entire family when there's a famine in Israel. They all come down and move to Egypt, and there they settle. When the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, begins, many generations have passed, and the Pharaoh has forgotten the history of the Israelites. Now they're no better than indentured servants, farmers that are called up whenever the Pharaoh needs them to do his heavy lifting. And so Exodus begins with God's people in slavery, wishing that they could be set free, wishing that they could leave and go back to their homeland. Genesis was that first descent down the W. Exodus begins the return up the W back towards the promised land. God calls Moses out of a burning bush and says, Moses, I want you to go and set my people free. And Moses says, I don't wanna. And God says, well, you're gonna. That's all in the Hebrew. So Moses goes and stands before the Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no. And God sends plagues, 10 of them, onto Egypt, destroying first their water sources and then their crops and their land and eventually their health. And finally, the last plague of Egypt takes the firstborn son of all the Egyptians. The Hebrews flee out into the wilderness and begin their trek through the desert to return back to the land that once belonged to Abraham and Sarah. Moses leads them through the journey. There are all kinds of stories of betrayal and backstabbing and miraculous providence and bread falling from the sky. They end up back in the promised land under the leadership of Moses' apprentice, Joshua. Joshua leads them home, back into the promised land. Now we're at the center point of the W. We've returned and they're back in the land that they were promised. There's a season in which various leaders rule over them called judges, but eventually God's people say, we want a king to rule over us. And God says, you're not going to like it. And the people say, well, we want it anyway. And so there's this brilliant passage in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where Samuel says to the people, if you appoint a king, your king will rule over you. He will take your sons into his armies and your daughters into his kitchens. He will take taxes from you. And on that day, when you call out to God, God will not deliver you. And they replied, we want a king anyway. And so God says to Samuel, it's not you they're rejecting, it's me they're rejecting. Listen to them and give them a king. And so Samuel goes and anoints Saul, the first king of Israel, and Saul is not a very good king and doesn't last very long. But Saul's son-in-law, David, becomes the second king of Israel. Samuel goes and anoints David to be king. And David is the best king in Israel's history. He's an incredibly flawed man. He lives a violent life, ends up committing adultery and murder. But in his brokenness, he returns to God and repents. And God establishes a covenant with David's household and says, there will be a king forever in your bloodline on the throne of Israel. And so forever after David, the Israelites would always look back and remember the promises of God and say, the day's going to come where we get to have a king in the line of David on the throne again. And the vision was for a kingdom where God's peace reigned on the earth. God would speak to the king, and king would rule over the people justly. There would be a beautiful city in Jerusalem with safe walls around it, an army to protect the people, and good governance. The temple would be in the center of the city, and God's people would worship in safety and peace. That was the vision of Israel. That was the highlight. And forever after, when the Israelites talked about the kingdom, that's what they were talking about. That's what they were looking forward to. When will we have our kingdom again? David rules for a season and then passes the leadership to his son Solomon. Solomon begins as a wise king, praying for God's guidance as he leads the people. But over the course of time, Solomon becomes very rich and very famous. And he begins to intermarry with all the princesses of the surrounding nations. It says that Solomon had some 1,000 wives and concubines surrounding him. As opposed to just licentiousness, what's most likely going on is Solomon realizes that if he marries the daughter of the king who lives next door, his father-in-law is less likely to come and declare war on Israel. So he's brokering political treatises, political deals with these marriages. But then something happens. The wives of these surrounding nations come to Solomon and say, look, you're rich, and you have a beautiful temple that you've built. My kingdom is small. My tribe doesn't have a temple. Give us money so we can go build a temple to our God. And Solomon did. He built temples to foreign gods, which in Israel's history would have been blasphemy. He even went and worshiped those gods. So sometime later, after Solomon passed the kingdom on, Israel would end up in a civil war, north against the south, and it would split in half. Many centuries later, Jesus would say, a kingdom divided against itself will fall. That's a reference to the history of Israel's people. When they were divided, they were weaker, two separate countries instead of one. As a consequence, Assyria would come in and conquer the north, which was Israel, and Babylon would come in and conquer the south, which was Judah. At that point, all of the remaining Israelites were taken off into slavery in Babylon. This is now the descent, the second descent in the W, the second bar in which they've fallen again out of the land that was once theirs. On the second downward stroke of the W, all of the prophets of Israel arise. The prophets who declare that if the people are not faithful to God, God will let their kingdom fall apart. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel, they tell the people that God wants his people to be faithful, and if they refuse to be faithful, their kingdom will not be protected. Well, they end up in slavery in Babylon again. Shame upon shame, having lost the kingdom that they once established. No longer holding on to the promises of Abraham, nor the covenant with David, they're now afraid that their kingdom will be lost forever, that their culture will be lost, that their identity will disappear. It's in this season that a group of people decide to stay separate from the Babylonian culture, not eat its food, maintain the language and rituals of the Jewish people. There was a brief season in which they remain in slavery in Babylon, but at that point, there's always a bigger fish. Cyrus, king of Persia, comes and conquers Babylon. And Cyrus allows the slave people to go back and rebuild their homeland. So the Israelites then leave Babylon, and as is recorded in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the last couple of prophets in the Old Testament, they return and go back and resettle their homeland. They move back in and they rebuild the altar and then the foundation of the temple. And it says, the old men wept and the young men cheered. The old men remembered the days of the former temple, and the young men cherished the idea that now they would be free. They rebuilt their homeland and their city and their walls. And the Hebrew scriptures end on a cliffhanger. They end waiting for the king who will come in the bloodline of David and reestablish Israel, reestablish the kingdom the way it once was. A kingdom in which God's peace reigns through a good king and strong walls and an army and justice over the land. The New Testament picks up where the Old Testament leaves off. You can imagine the Old Testament ending this way. An empty throne sits in Israel, in Jerusalem, and the camera pans back from that empty throne, asking the question, who will come and take it? Who will come and sit on the throne? The New Testament begins with that same camera now panning in, past a star in the sky, past shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night, down to a throne that has been disassembled and reassembled as a manger. The King has come. Jesus of Nazareth was the king in the bloodline of David who came to establish God's peace on the earth once and for all. It wouldn't be like the kingdom they had dreamed of. It was going to be a very different kind of kingdom. But Jesus was the fulfillment of the whole search and story of the Bible. So that is the outline of the Bible. It's shaped like a W. They're in their land and then out, and then in and then out, and then in again. Abraham and Sarah sit on it, and then they're lost in slavery in Egypt. David goes and returns to it, and then they're lost in slavery in Babylon. And finally, Ezra and Nehemiah return them, and Jesus is the conclusion of the search, the last peak in the W. And that is a story all its own. But now you have a good sense for the outline of the scriptures. You know how the Bible is laid out. And hopefully, given that structure, whenever you hear a story about the Bible, whether it's about Jesus or a whale or a lion's den, you know where to put it in the story. You have a better sense for how the story flows. I hope that's helpful for you. God bless you. I'll see you again soon.